Okay, so the consequences of this Union defeat, tactical defeat at Bull Run were immense. First of all, we have the emergence of the famous Stonewall Jackson, and again, uh, you're going to need to look at Cat, and he'll fill in much more of the story about the battle aspects of the Civil War than I will, but hopefully I'm giving you a framework for thinking about it. Anyway, uh, the Confederates gained confidence. They have defeated the Union Army, but they're actually as disorganized in victory as the Union was in defeat. And they're unable to take advantage of their victory. For instance, they don't march into Washington and capture it. They just don't have the power to do it. But here's the big thing. After Bull Run, the Lincoln administration realizes, holy cow, this is going to be a million times tougher than we thought it was going to be. And so Bull Run proved to be a reality check for Lincoln and his officials. They realize it's not going to be defeated by 75,000 men serving for 3 months. So what he does within a week of Bull Run, Congress passes, and remember, Congress at this point is made up, it's dominated by Republicans. There are Democrats, but Republicans are in the majority. And again, remember, Southern states, when they left the Union, they took their representatives with them. Anyway, so Lincoln signed 2 bills. And ultimately, what these 2 bills called for was the enlistment of 1 million men that would sign up for 3-year tours of duty. So suddenly now we're getting very serious. 1 million men that would volunteer. They were not drafted. They would be volunteers, and that they would sign up for 3 years instead of the 3 months that Lincoln had initially called for. So what we're seeing here is we're getting the creation of a professional army, of an army much more organized, much more of a regular army rather than just a militia. So 1 million men signing up for 3-year terms. McDowell was replaced by George B. McClellan, and one of the students talked about yesterday, McClellan ultimately would run against Abraham Lincoln in 1864, so you can kind of guess the trajectory of McClellan. But he is appointed as commander of the Union Army, and what happens is in Virginia, for the next almost year, what happens in Virginia is McClellan just builds up the Union Army. There's no significant battles in Virginia. McClellan just focuses on creating a real army. And actually, that was his genius. He was quite a good organizer. He was terrible in battlefield, but he was a very, very good organizer. McClellan is a very interesting guy. He was a brilliant engineer, a very capable organizer. He graduated second in his class at West Point. He served as a railroad engineer. He was a very successful railroad executive when the Civil War began. When the war began, though, he went back into the Union Army. He was a young guy, he's only in his mid-30s. He rose very, very quickly in the Union Army because before he'd left the Army in the 1850s, he'd fought successfully in Mexico. He was seen as a rising star in the U.S. Army. He goes into the corporate world after the Civil War begins. He comes back into the Army. And there weren't that many officers, right? And so someone like McClellan, it was a great opportunity for him, and he rises very, very quickly in the ranks. He won some victories in the western part of Virginia early in the war, and this is what allowed West Virginia to come into existence. It's a complicated story, but the western part of Virginia hated the eastern part of Virginia. There wasn't slavery in the western part of Virginia. It's kind of Appalachian territory. And so what happens is, during the Civil War, ironically, or perhaps hypocritically, West Virginia secedes from Virginia and becomes its own separate state, and it's a state in the Union. you know, it's a little bit of an inconsistency on Lincoln's part that he would allow that to happen. But hey, it's a war, right? Um, he he is appointed after the Bull Run disaster. He's appointed the head of Union forces in Virginia, and we start to see some aspects of McClellan come out that aren't very attractive. He's incredibly arrogant, although his soldiers really loved him. Um, his quick rise to power intoxicated him. His ego really ballooned. He was called the young Napoleon. People thought that this guy was going to be the guy that was going to save the Union. And so he comes to D.C. and he starts organizing this army, which has now grown, or will very quickly grow, to 1 million men. And it becomes what is called the Army of the Potomac. The Army of the Potomac is the Union Army in the Eastern Theater, in the area of D.C. and Virginia. It's called the Army of the Potomac. It's named after the Potomac River. The Union tended to name its armies after rivers. The Confederates tended to name its armies after regions. So the Confederate Army is called the Army of Northern Virginia. So anyway, the Union Army is the Army of the Potomac. And what he has is, very quickly, his army is growing to 100,000 men and even more. He organizes them, he drills them, he teaches them how to be soldiers. And he's actually quite good at this. And he's really loved by his soldiers. But McClellan, who grew so egotistical, he began to think that he was more important than Abraham Lincoln. And he became incredibly insubordinate to Lincoln. McClellan thought Lincoln was a moron. He would come to cabinet meetings and he wouldn't say a word. He would kind of pretend that he had these great secrets. He wouldn't go to Lincoln. He forced Lincoln to come to him. And there's a very famous story. And remember, there's this gap. The first Bull Run happens in July of '62, and we're not going to see major action in Virginia for almost another year. And so people are starting to wonder what the hell's going on. I mean, we know it's going to take McClellan time to build the army, but what's taking him so long? But anyway, he still has a lot of political capital. People believe in him. But there's this famous story where Lincoln comes to McClellan's house to meet with him. Incredible. Lincoln's the president. He's sitting there waiting for McClellan. McClellan comes in, walks right past Lincoln, goes to his bedroom and sends out an aide and tells Lincoln that he's not going to meet with him, that he's tired, and that he doesn't have time to meet with him. I mean, that's really an incredible story, right? Lincoln comes to his house and McClellan completely blows him off. And we know for a fact that McClellan despised Lincoln because his letters to his wife were released in the 1880s, and they're just full. McClellan calls Lincoln a gorilla. He just really despised Lincoln, had no respect for him whatsoever. So by the end of '61, people are starting to ask questions. In early '62, what's going on? What's taking McClellan so long? Now, Lincoln actually could work with McClellan. Lincoln was he was an incredibly confident person. And, you know, he said that he would hold McClellan's horse if McClellan would give him a victory. So Lincoln is really an amazing guy. You know, he's confident enough to be modest, if that makes sense. So he's willing to go along with McClellan as long as he thinks McClellan can do the job. But once he decides McClellan can't do the job, which will happen in the near future, he cuts him loose quickly. But we're not there yet. So by December '61, early '62, Lincoln is growing impatient, and he's saying to McClellan, "What are you doing? We just built this army. I've just called up a million men. You've got about 100,000 men in the D.C. area. When are you going to use this army? Remember, Confederate forces were still camped out in Manassas, just outside of Washington, D.C., and it's actually becoming, a real embarrassment to Abraham Lincoln. So by early 62, just a little less than a year after the Civil War began, um, nothing seems to be happening. And then in March of 62, the Confederates secretly, they withdraw from their position at Bull Run, and they consolidate their forces a little bit further south towards Richmond. And this is really embarrassing for McClellan. It's really embarrassing for Lincoln. When reporters go to the Confederate position at Manassas, they realize that a lot of the so-called cannon that had been there were actually wooden cannon that had been painted black to look like real cannon. And it turned out the press called these Quaker guns. And it turned out that the Confederate position was much weaker than McClellan had thought. One of McClellan's big problems is he had too much of an active imagination, and he always overestimated the size of the enemy force that was facing him. He thought that there were 100,000 Confederates at Manassas, when at most there were 35,000 or 40,000. And this overestimation of the enemy is a big problem for McClellan, and it's going to bite him in the ass a number of times during the Civil War. So in March of 62, one reporter comes back from the Manassas position, and he says, "I return from this visit to Manassas feeling that their retreat is our defeat." So that's where I'll leave you today. It's March of 62. McClellan has built this army in D.C. The war's almost a year old. The Confederate forces have on their own consolidated and left Manassas, moved a little bit closer to Richmond to take a stronger position. And there's growing impatience with George McClellan. He's built this army. We've given him all these men, everything you've asked for. What are you going to do?